Welcome to Education Update. I'm Rafael P. Roman. It's become an accepted part of the American education system. What our children learn depends on which state they live in. In 2010, a coalition of states and education experts set out to change this with the new Common Core state standards for English and math, which more than 40 states have now adopted. In this episode, we'll look at the Common Core state standards for English language arts and literacy and what they'll mean for our nation's schools. For decades, it was up to local school districts to come up with standards, the set of expectations of what kids need to know and be able to do. This meant thousands of different sets of standards that varied widely and experts say led to disparities in achievement. In the late 80s, a movement kicked off to improve the nation's learning standards, and states took on the task.
States generally got teachers together and came up with a set of ideas about here's what kids should know and do in these core subjects. Well, not surprisingly, those standards were literally all over the map.
And so what we found in too many states was a plethora of expectations, almost an unteachable curriculum that expectations were too broad.
Not only were many state standards too broad to teach, a problem experts call a mile wide and an inch deep, they also varied considerably.
Because standards vary so much from state to state, a young person might leave Memphis and move to Boston and suddenly realize upon arriving in Boston that he or she is in fact not ready for college.
So it began to become apparent that we had very different expectations for students from state to state for no particularly good reason.
These different expectations in each state presented a problem when the No Child Left Behind law began holding states accountable with tests based on the different standards. Experts say instead of improving student performance, it created an incentive to make tests easier and expectations lower.
And what became clear is that we had a charade. In most states, we were telling parents that their children were doing just fine. They were passing the test. They were proficient, according to the state, in English and math. But then those same kids would go on to college and have to take remedial courses because they weren't prepared at all.
Far too many students who are in remediation never get out. And for those students, the possibility of a good paying job that can support a family or full-fledged citizenry in which they participate as a full member of our democracy is scarce and limited.
In 2009, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers launched an effort to come up with one set of standards for all states. The Common Core state standards were released in June 2010. More than 40 states have now agreed to replace their English and math standards with the Common Core by 2014, when new state assessments are expected to be introduced. Susan Pimentel, a consultant and standards expert, and David Coleman, who founded the education think tank Student Achievement Partners, led a team of about 70 teachers and experts who spent a year writing the new standards for English language arts and literacy. They are broken into 4 main content categories: reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. Each section begins with something called the College and Career Readiness Anchor Standards, broad standards defining what kids should know and be able to do to be successful in college and on the job. These standards correspond one-to-one with the specific content standards that follow.
We've heard from teachers around the country that have been looking at the standards that it keeps a focus for them about what it is they're preparing students for. So even if I'm a third grade teacher, wow, I have a role to play here in preparing students for college and career readiness. So there's a place there to really keep the focus on where it is I'm heading and what it is I'm preparing my students for.
The content standards begin with that most fundamental of skills, reading. The anchor standards here emphasize reading closely, making logical inferences, citing specific textual evidence, and reading complex texts, a key concept experts say we have not been getting right in the classroom.
What's been happening is that the reading that we've been asking students to do all the way along and in high school has begun to go down, but the reading that we ask for students to do in college and then if they get into their careers has actually stayed steady or gone up, and the difference is wide.
Another big shift in the reading standards, more nonfiction. Experts say that while literature like fiction and poetry is important, kids must also be reading informational texts.
When you look at what students actually read and what we read as adults and when we graduate and are on careers and jobs and just in life, is about 80% of what we read is informational text.
Students need to be able to read technical writing, as well as historical and scientific writing, as well as literature and literary writing.
It's for this reason that there are 2 sets of reading standards across all grades: reading literature and reading informational text. Things like essays, news articles, and historical documents. By fourth grade, at least half of students' reading should be informational, and by high school, at least 70%. And the responsibility for teaching all this doesn't fall just on English teachers. The standards call for literacy and writing to be taught across all disciplines: history, social studies, science, and technical subjects.
There is no way we will break the barrier of 8th grade reading scores in this country being flat for decades unless science and history teachers are full partners in demanding that students read and write to gain knowledge in their disciplines.
19th century European imperialism in Africa resulted...
David Riesenfeld is a social studies and history teacher at Robert Wagner High School in Queens, New York. He started working with the Common Core Standards for Literacy as part of a citywide pilot.
We're looking at how to work specifically on kids reading more complex text. So we started by looking at the concept of finding textual evidence in primary and secondary sources.
To prepare for today's history class, a debate on European imperialism in Africa, his 10th graders studied photos and illustrations from an eyewitness book on Africa, read an essay by 16th century social reformer Bartolomé de las Casas, and read excerpts from the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, a complex text recommended in the Standards Appendix. Riesenfeld now assesses all his class readings with a text complexity rubric developed through the pilot.
There's a heavy component in these standards that try to address the things that kids are going to need to know as they walk into any aspect of life. Anywhere from the auto mechanic to the university professor, we're going to have to look at how kids can take information that they're presented with, whether it's a manual or an academic text, and understand what to do with it.
The ability to read well connects directly with the ability to write well, which is the next section of the Common Core Standards. Here again, experts say the type of writing kids have traditionally done is not preparing them for life after high school.
Today, in the American high school, the most popular forms of writing are likely a narrative of your own experience and a narrative of your own opinion.
When's the last time, an employer asked one of us to write a story about ourselves? No, they ask us to read something and then write about it.
What you have to be able to do is show what you can argue based on evidence and show that you can convey complex information clearly.
The Anchor Standards for Writing emphasize writing arguments, writing informative and explanatory texts, drawing evidence from text to support analysis, and assessing the credibility and accuracy of sources, something Jill Lee, an English teacher at Hillcrest High School in Queens, New York, is working on today.
How do you know what he's saying is real or not?
Lee's students are preparing to write an argumentative essay by reading informational texts, including a New York Times column about the role of social media in the Middle East uprisings and a report on media use among kids and teens.
The biggest increases are in TV and video game use.
One of the things that we noticed about our high school kids is that we're not preparing them for college. They need to know how to read sources, they need to know how to independently research papers, and they need to know how to write a proper paper. It is really important for them to know, number one, that there are various sources. Some are reliable and some are not, and they need to independently be able to determine that.
If you look at the standards throughout, the core of them is evidence. The core of them is having mastery of the evidence when you're reading, when you're writing, as well as when you're speaking and listening.
Speaking and listening is the next section of the Common Core State Standards. The Anchor Standards here emphasize participating in a range of conversations and collaborations, expressing ideas clearly and persuasively, and adapting speech to a variety of contexts.
The strands of speaking and listening require a student to build the ability to share evidence, not only in formal ways, like a formal presentation, but in everyday conversation.
You guys can turn to page 12.
At Fillmore Academy in Brooklyn, New York, also a Common Core pilot school, 7th grade students are conducting a conversation based on an article they read about child marriage in Afghanistan.
The most recent UNICEF study found that 43% of Afghan women were married before age 18.
Once they were sold, the girls were considered as property.
Child brides are also at greater risk for domestic violence.
Teacher Rosemary Cantelmo thinks this type of work will go a long way towards preparing her kids for the real world.
Well, they'll be in a situation where they have to interact with people. It's not only going to be them and a book. You go into business and you need to, sit at a meeting. You need to be, how to cite your information and not just talk randomly. This is a life experience to be socially adept in conversation.
The final section is language. The Anchor Standards here emphasize a command of the conventions of Standard English, knowledge of language, and vocabulary acquisition and use, especially academic vocabulary. Susan Pimentel says there was some disagreement about whether to include a separate section just for language.
We took some heat on that, but we thought it was important enough because we hear from the business community who say grammar and conventions are important. I'm not going to hire somebody if a letter is filled with mistakes. I mean, they meant that both in terms of writing and also in terms of speaking and listening.
Let's talk about the customs.
Cantelmo co-teaches with Bridget Cronin, a special education teacher. The standards don't contain sections specifically for special populations, like children with special needs or English language learners, but Cronin says she's found them accessible to all learners.
Using the Common Core standards definitely does bring tasks to another level. All students, whether they're struggling or they're the top of the class, they're able to accomplish these standards. It's just the means of getting there that may be different.
What we've lost, I think, in this country is the fact that there's no shame for any one of us to pick up a piece of reading and not get it the first time around. That sometimes I have to read it, and oftentimes I have to read it again, and I have to read it again, perhaps with maybe some scaffolding, someone giving me some good questions about it, someone helping me through it. I happen to believe there's genius in every child, and it's our job as educators to find that and to nurture that.
States are allowed to add 15% more content to the standards. For example, New York added a section for pre-kindergartners and standards to reflect the cultural diversity of the state. John King is a New York State Education Commissioner.
Now, why is it important to allow states to add some of their own content to the standards? Doesn't that defeat the purpose?
The standards effort, I think, wanted to be respectful of state differences and state autonomy, make sure that the standards ultimately reflect what local leadership in each state feels is best for students. And I think over time, if states arrive at additional standards that make a real difference for students, other states will learn from that example.
In many ways, the hard work is just now getting underway, as states, districts, and schools restructure their curricula and instruction before 2014, when new exams aligned with the Common Core are expected to go into effect. Two groups of states are now designing these new assessments, which will likely look a lot different.
We expect them to be more performance-based, so a lot more writing, a lot more opportunity for students to apply their knowledge. Our other hope is that we're able to have the assessments not just happen one time at the end of the year, but that we're able to embed the assessments in the instruction over the course of the year.
State exams that are aligned to the Common Core will be more rigorous than the ones we're currently using.
Maggie Bailey Tang is an instructional coach for the New York City schools. She's helping prepare teachers and administrators for the new standards and the new exams. She says she's hearing some anxiety.
They're worried. They're worried they're not going to be ready in time for the state test when they change in 2014. They're a bit overwhelmed. What I'm doing to help them prepare is to identify the areas in the Common Core state standards that are similar to the current state standards so they can see that they don't have to start all over again. This isn't starting from day one. They're doing some of these things already. So if we can start there and start the alignment there, then they feel better.
Bailey Tang says it will be crucial for teachers to have adequate time and resources to implement the Common Core state standards in their classrooms. Scarce commodities made even more rare by the recession and budget cuts across the country. But despite the challenges, supporters say we need to move forward.
What's at stake if we don't get this right?
I think our economic future as a country and the future of our democracy. At some level, we can't sustain our current level of prosperity unless our graduates are competitive with the graduates of high schools all across the world. I think we ought to have, across the education sector, an incredible sense of urgency about that.